Have you ever found yourself lying awake at night, wondering if you did too much, or maybe not enough, for your children? Maybe you replay conversations in your mind. You think about the way your daughter sounded on the phone, or how your son seemed distant the last time you saw him. And before you even realize it, you start asking yourself questions that feel heavy, questions like, did I upset them, or is this somehow my fault? If you've ever felt that quiet pressure, that invisible weight of still needing to keep your children happy, even now, you are not alone. For so many women, especially those of us who spent decades caring, giving, sacrificing, and putting others first, motherhood doesn't just end when your children grow up. In many ways, it lingers. It reshapes itself. And sometimes, it becomes even harder. Because now, you're not just raising children anymore. You're navigating relationships with adults who have their own lives, their own struggles, their own emotions, and yet, somehow, you still feel responsible for how they feel. Today, I want to gently walk with you through something that can change your life in the most freeing way. We're going to talk about 7 things you should never continue doing for your children, not because you don't love them, but because you do. And because you finally deserve peace, clarity, and a life that belongs to you too. Let's begin with something that sits quietly at the center of so many mothers' hearts. There is a belief many of us were never taught to question, the idea that we are responsible for our children's happiness. When they were little, that may have felt true. You comforted them when they cried. You fixed what you could. You tried to make their world safe and warm. That was love. That was motherhood. But somewhere along the way, that responsibility didn't fade, it just changed shape. Now, when your adult child is upset, stressed, or unhappy, you may feel it deep in your body. You might feel a tightening in your chest. You might rush to fix it, offer advice, or even change your own behavior just to avoid upsetting them further. You might find yourself walking on eggshells, choosing your words carefully, holding back your truth, or overextending yourself just to keep things calm. And without even realizing it, their emotional state becomes your responsibility all over again. But here is something I want you to hear, slowly and clearly. Your children's emotions are not yours to carry. They were never meant to be. Your children are grown. They have their own thoughts, their own feelings, their own journeys. And while it is natural to care deeply, it is not your job to manage how they feel. Think about how exhausting it is to constantly monitor someone else's mood. To adjust yourself just to keep things steady. Over time, that kind of emotional responsibility doesn't bring closeness. It brings quiet resentment, anxiety, and a sense of losing yourself. Real love does not require you to disappear. You can care without carrying. You can support without sacrificing your peace. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is allow your children to experience their own emotions without stepping in to fix them. Now, there is something that often follows right behind this, something that can feel even more powerful. Guilt. Guilt has a way of slipping into your thoughts so quietly that you don't even question it. It shows up when you say no. It shows up when you choose yourself. It shows up when you don't answer the phone right away, or when you decide you simply don't have the energy. And suddenly, you feel like you've done something wrong. You might hear a voice in your head saying, "A good mother would do more," or "They need me," or "I shouldn't be so selfish." But I want you to pause for a moment and ask yourself something important. Where did that voice come from? Because often, that guilt isn't really about love. It's about conditioning. It's about years, sometimes decades, of being taught that your value comes from how much you give, how much you sacrifice, and how much you endure. And so, even now, when your body is tired, when your heart needs rest, you feel pulled to keep going, to keep giving, to keep saying yes. But guilt is not always a sign that you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it's a sign that you're doing something different. Something healthier. Something necessary. Letting guilt control your actions keeps you stuck in a cycle where your needs are always pushed aside. You end up saying yes when you mean no. You show up when you're drained. You give when you have nothing left. And over time, that doesn't create stronger relationships, it creates imbalance. Imagine, instead, what it would feel like to pause when that guilt shows up, to take a breath, and to ask, is this truly my responsibility? You may find that the answer is no. And that no is not something to feel ashamed of. It is something to honor. Because every time you choose yourself, even in small ways, you are teaching your children something powerful, that love does not mean losing yourself. And that brings us to something many women struggle with, often without even realizing it. The habit of sacrificing your own needs to keep your children comfortable. For years, maybe even decades, you learned that being a good mother meant putting yourself last. You made sure everyone else was okay before you even thought about what you needed. You skipped rest. You ignored your own feelings. You said yes when your heart was whispering no. And it made sense at the time. Your children depended on you. But now, things are different. And yet, the pattern often remains. You may still find yourself rearranging your plans to fit their needs. Dropping everything to help. Giving your time, your energy, your emotional support, even when it leaves you feeling depleted. And the hardest part is, you might not even notice how much you're giving up, until you feel that quiet exhaustion settle in. That sense that somewhere along the way, you disappeared. But here's something that might feel surprising at first. Sacrificing yourself does not create peace. It simply shifts the imbalance. It means they are comfortable, and you are not. And over time, that kind of imbalance doesn't lead to closeness. It leads to frustration, unspoken resentment, and emotional distance. Your needs matter. Your rest matters. Your time matters. And honoring those things does not make you a bad mother. It makes you a whole person. A healthier, stronger, more grounded presence in your children's lives. Because when you begin to take care of yourself, truly take care of yourself, something beautiful happens. You show up with more patience, more clarity, more genuine love. Not the kind of love that is driven by obligation, but the kind that flows naturally, without pressure. And that is the kind of love that lasts. Now, as we continue, there's another pattern that quietly shapes so many relationships between mothers and their adult children, one that often goes unnoticed, but deeply felt. It's the way boundaries begin to blur, or sometimes disappear altogether. When your children were young, boundaries weren't something you really thought about. Of course you were available. Of course you were involved in everything. Your life and theirs were intertwined in a way that felt natural. But as they grew older, something was supposed to shift. And for many mothers, that shift never fully happened. Maybe your child calls at all hours and expects you to be ready, no matter what you're doing. Maybe they make decisions that affect you without really asking. Maybe they speak to you in ways that don't feel respectful, and instead of addressing it, you let it slide, telling yourself it's not worth the conflict. Or maybe it's more subtle. Maybe you feel like you can't say no without risking distance. Like setting a boundary might push them away. So you stay quiet. You tolerate things that don't feel right. You allow your space, your time, even your emotional well-being to be stretched thin, just to keep the connection intact. But here's something deeply important to understand. Love without boundaries is not healthy love. It's a quiet form of self-abandonment. Boundaries are not walls that push your children away. They are gentle lines that show where you end and where they begin. And without those lines, relationships can become confusing, draining, and even painful. You are allowed to say, "I'm not available right now." You are allowed to say, "That doesn't work for me." You are allowed to expect respect, even from your own children. In fact, especially from your own children. Because when you model healthy boundaries, you are not damaging the relationship, you are strengthening it. You are teaching them how to relate to you as an adult, not just as someone who exists to meet their needs. And yes, it may feel uncomfortable at first. They may not understand right away. There may even be moments of tension. But discomfort is not the same as disconnection. Sometimes it's the beginning of something more honest, more balanced, more real. And that leads us into another pattern that many women carry quietly, often without realizing just how deeply it affects them. It's the habit of explaining away your children's harmful behavior. You might hear yourself saying things like, "They're just stressed," or "They didn't mean it," or "That's just how they are." You might minimize moments that hurt you, overlook words that felt sharp, excuse behavior that, if it came from anyone else, you would immediately recognize as unacceptable. And again, this comes from love. You want to understand them. You want to keep the relationship intact. You don't want to create distance. But when you constantly justify behavior that hurts you, something important gets lost. Your truth. Your experience. Your voice. Over time, this creates a quiet pattern where your feelings are pushed aside and their behavior, no matter how harmful, goes unchallenged. And without realizing it, you begin to carry the emotional weight of something that was never yours to carry. Because here's the truth. Understanding someone's struggles does not mean accepting behavior that causes harm. You can have compassion and still have clarity. You can say, "I understand you're going through something," and also say, "That doesn't make it okay to treat me this way." Both can exist at the same time. And when you begin to speak that truth, gently but firmly, something shifts. You step out of the role of absorbing everything and into the role of honoring yourself. That shift is not about creating distance. It's about creating honesty. And honesty is what allows relationships to grow in a healthy direction. Now, there's another pattern that often follows closely behind this, one that many women have lived with for so long, it almost feels normal. Keeping the peace at any cost. You may have learned, somewhere along the way, that peace meant avoiding conflict. That staying quiet was better than speaking up. That it was easier to let things go than to risk tension. And maybe, for a time, that worked. Maybe it kept things calm on the surface. But underneath, something was building. Because every time you silence yourself, every time you push down what you feel, every time you ignore your own emotional needs just to keep things smooth, it doesn't disappear. It stays. It accumulates. It turns into stress, anxiety, and emotional exhaustion. You might notice it in small ways at first. Feeling drained after conversations. Feeling a heaviness you can't quite explain. Feeling like you're constantly holding something in. And over time, that weight can grow into something much deeper. Because your mental health matters. Your emotional well-being matters. And peace that requires you to lose yourself is not real peace. It's quiet suffering. True peace includes you. It includes your voice, your feelings, your needs. And sometimes, creating that kind of peace means allowing a little discomfort in the moment, so you can have something much healthier in the long run. It means having conversations that feel difficult. It means expressing what you've been holding inside. It means choosing honesty over silence. And that can feel scary. Especially if you've spent years, or even a lifetime, doing the opposite. But you are allowed to change. You are allowed to take care of your mind, your heart, your energy. Because when you begin to protect your mental health, everything else in your life begins to shift in a positive way. Your relationships feel lighter. Your thoughts feel clearer. And you begin to reconnect with a sense of calm that doesn't depend on anyone else. There's one more pattern, though, that quietly influences so much of how you show up as a mother, even now. And it often goes unnoticed because it feels so deeply tied to love. It's the need for validation. That quiet hope that your children will see you, appreciate you, acknowledge everything you've done. Maybe you find yourself waiting for a thank you that never quite comes. Or hoping they'll recognize your sacrifices, your care, your presence. And when that recognition doesn't happen, it can leave you feeling invisible, unseen, unappreciated. And so, without even realizing it, you may try a little harder. Give a little more. Show up in ways that stretch you, just hoping that this time it will be enough. But here's something that may feel both tender and freeing at the same time. Your worth is not something your children can give you. And it's not something they can take away. It has never depended on their recognition. You were worthy long before they were born. And you are still worthy now, exactly as you are. When you begin to release the need for validation from your children, something powerful happens. You stop overextending yourself. You stop tying your value to their responses. And you begin to stand in a quieter, steadier sense of self. One that doesn't need to be proven. One that doesn't need to be earned. Just lived. And from that place, you can love your children in a way that feels lighter, freer, and more genuine. Not from a place of needing something in return, but from a place of already being whole. And that changes everything. And when you begin to feel that shift, even in small, quiet moments, something inside you starts to settle. You may notice that you're no longer reacting the same way you used to. The things that once pulled you in, those waves of worry, guilt, or urgency, don't feel quite as powerful. You pause a little more. You breathe a little deeper. You begin to respond instead of react. And in that space, you start to rediscover yourself. Not just as a mother, but as a woman who has lived, loved, endured, and grown through so many seasons of life. Because the truth is, you were never meant to disappear inside your role as a parent. You were never meant to spend the rest of your life carrying emotional burdens that no longer belong to you. You were meant to evolve. To step into a new chapter where love is no longer about sacrifice, but about balance. Where connection is no longer about control, but about respect. Where your identity is no longer tied to how much you give, but to who you truly are. And I know that can feel unfamiliar at first. After all, for so many years, your focus has been outward. You've been the one others leaned on. The one who held things together. The one who showed up, again and again, no matter how tired you were. So turning inward, choosing yourself, it might feel uncomfortable. It might even feel wrong. But it isn't. It's necessary. Because this stage of life is not about doing more. It's about living more fully, more honestly, more peacefully. And that begins with small, gentle changes. It might look like pausing before you say yes and asking yourself, do I truly have the energy for this? It might look like speaking up, even when your voice shakes a little, and saying, that doesn't feel right to me. It might look like allowing your children to handle their own problems, even when every instinct tells you to step in. And yes, there may be moments when it feels unfamiliar. Moments when you question yourself. Moments when old habits try to pull you back into patterns that feel safe, simply because they are familiar. But every time you choose differently, every time you honor your needs, your boundaries, your peace, you are creating something new. A new way of relating. A new way of living. a new way of loving. And over time, those small choices begin to build something strong and steady inside you. A sense of self that doesn't waver based on someone else's mood. A sense of calm that isn't dependent on keeping everything perfect. A sense of worth that comes from within, not from outside approval. And from that place, your relationships can begin to change in beautiful ways. Because when you stop overgiving, you create space for your children to step forward in their own lives. When you stop managing their emotions, you allow them to develop their own emotional strength. When you stop seeking validation, you show them what it looks like to stand confidently in who you are. And that, in itself, is one of the greatest gifts you can give them. Not constant sacrifice, but a living example of self-respect. Not endless availability, but a balanced, healthy presence. Not silent endurance, but honest, grounded connection. And I want to remind you of something very important. None of this means you love your children any less. If anything, it means you are loving them in a deeper, more sustainable way. A way that doesn't drain you. A way that doesn't erase you. A way that allows both of you to grow. Because love, at its healthiest, is not about losing yourself for someone else. It's about showing up as your full self and allowing others to do the same. Now, as you sit with these ideas, you might notice certain thoughts or feelings coming up. Maybe a memory. Maybe a moment where you wish you had done things differently. Maybe even a little bit of sadness or regret. And that's okay. You are human. You did the best you could with what you knew at the time. And this, right now, is not about looking back with judgment. It's about moving forward with awareness. With compassion for yourself. With the understanding that it's never too late to create change. No matter your age. No matter how long the patterns have been there. Change can begin in a single moment. In a single choice. In a single breath where you decide, I matter too. And if this message speaks to you, I would love to hear from you. Have you ever found yourself feeling responsible for your children's happiness, even now? Have you struggled with setting boundaries or saying no without guilt? You are not alone in this journey, and sharing your experience might help someone else feel seen too. If you found comfort or clarity in today's conversation, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel Elderly Faith Journey. This space is here for you, to support you, to uplift you, and to remind you that this stage of life can be one of the most peaceful and fulfilling yet. And as you move forward from here, carry this with you. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to live a life that feels calm, balanced, and true to who you are. And that doesn't take anything away from your children. It simply brings you back to yourself. Here's to a softer heart, a clearer mind, and a life that finally feels like your own.